Garðabær is a quiet little town on the western coast of Iceland. It's thousands of kilometers away from Wall Street, but not far enough to shield its residents from the fallout of the financial crisis of 2008. The Olafssons bought a new house here back in 2007. The cost of borrowing was low at the time, so they thought it was the right time to become homeowners. But the quest for their dream home turned into a nightmare when interest rates began shooting up.
When the banks collapsed, the exchange rate more than doubled. So the amount the bank now wanted to collect was more than double what we had borrowed.
It happened because many of Iceland's banks had invested in the same problem loans in the US market that took down Lehman Brothers. Mounting losses forced the banks to raise rates, and that left thousands of Icelanders unable to repay their loans. By October 2008, the government had taken control of some of the country's biggest banks. In the UK, the central bank began pumping nearly $400 billion into financial institutions to keep them afloat, and many other countries followed suit. The total cost of bailouts, penalties, and lost productivity has towered beyond $21 trillion over the past decade. Global debt has mushroomed to $247 trillion as governments keep spending to boost their economies. And there are widespread psychological and social changes like rising distrust among people and the emergence of divisive politics. Some economists fear that's a toxic mix for another recession, and they say it's critically important to protect the most vulnerable.
We can begin by not turning a blind eye to the sentiments of the people we left behind. We must listen to what people have to say. The many people who fell through the cracks of society who were inadequately protected by the system.
But a decade later, people like the Olafssons are still struggling to pay off their crippling debt.
When you look at these 10 years, this is lost time. This is time that we have not been able to make any progress in our lives. We have not been able to plan for the future. We have not been able to go on vacations and make financial plans, and the biggest sacrifice is basically things we could have done with our sons, which we haven't done.
For them and for many others, the cost of the crisis goes far beyond numbers. Mobin Nasir, TRT World.
And Princeton's Professor Harold James and TRT World's editor-at-large Craig Copetas are both still with us. Professor James, I want to just show you both a chart showing what the IMF predicts the government debt to GDP ratio of the top 20 economies is like, how it's going to change over the next 5 years, according to them. And interestingly, the only one whose debt to GDP ratio that's expected to rise is that of the US. Everywhere else, that ratio is falling. Should the rest of the world be worried about that trajectory of the US?
Yes, obviously it should be worried. The world monetary system since the Second World War has basically been built around the US dollar. And one of the consequences of the crisis, not just of the last year or so, one of the consequences of the crisis has been that people ask themselves, isn't there a better monetary order that doesn't depend so much on the debt instruments of one country? So the US and the question of how much debt from the US government the world can tolerate is an actual one. Having said that, I think you really have the issue that the United States looks uniquely stable for a long period of time. And even at the moment, with all the political turmoil, the long-term future of the United States is, I think, pretty assured. And so this question of the US being a safe haven will be there for a long time, even if the debt ratio rises.
So to ask the question that you posed, is there an alternative to the system that the US has created?
I think there is. Historically, we've seen the transition. In the 19th century, the world was really built around the British currency, the pound sterling, and it's in the 20th century that the US dollar replaced sterling. In the 21st century, I think you can expect in the long run other currencies to emerge. The renminbi, I think in the long run will be a major part of the world economy. And the Europeans are actively talking about promoting the euro as an international currency. Just a couple of days ago, the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, made that very much part of his State of the Union speech, that the United States is in turmoil and the world needs something else.
Okay. Craig, very quickly, back in 2008, did you get the feeling that this would reverberate well beyond the US's shores?
I'll tell you what I reported from the yacht Caldera while the pomegranate martinis were being stirred, not shaken. While this crisis was happening, the bankers I was with were not concerned about fixing the crisis, repairing the crisis. They were looking to find ways to make money out of profiting from the biggest global financial disaster since the Great Depression. Can we scoop up cheap assets? There was zero concern during that week among the dozens of bankers whom I interviewed about fixing the mortgage crisis, about making people whole.
You're right. Okay.
It led to my favorite quote from Bertolt Brecht's Three-Penny Opera: "Eats first, morals after."
And Professor James, very quickly before we have to wrap up, China. I know it's a huge question, but with $40 trillion of debt, could China be the source of the next crisis?
I don't think anybody is unconcerned about the build-up of debt in China, but I think also it's not the immediate focus of concern at the moment. In the long run, obviously the question of how China handles its rise to being a mature economy is going to be a big issue, but I don't see that really as a pressing concern for the next immediate future.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Professor Harold James of Princeton and Craig Copetas, thank you both very much indeed.